Now, during Jesus' ministry, just as Herod's temple was brought into commission or brought into use, the Jewish culture known as Second Temple Judaism buzzed with messianic expectations. There were all different kinds of groups of Jewish peoples, different, I hate to say denominations, but that kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about here, but small Jewish groups, sects, who had different expectations about how the Messiah would come, what would bring the Messiah, what would hasten his coming, and so forth and so on. But they waited for this coming anointed person, an anointed leader, someone who would lead them out of the mess that they were in and would redeem Israel and bring history to some type of completion. Now, the appearance of this Messiah is part of an eschatological theme. Eschatology simply means study of end times. But you understand that when someone says, well, this is the way history is going to end, this is my eschatology, it also entails some ideas about the whole of history, okay? It's kind of like looking at an arrow mid-flight and saying, oh, I see where it's going to hit. This is how this is going to end. But to do that, you have to surmise the trajectory and where it came from, in a sense. And so an eschatology isn't just a view of the end, it's a view of the whole trajectory of history. And so Jews had an eschatology, and they look forward to the day of the Lord, that is kind of the culmination of history. But how you look at that, how you look at history, it also alters the way you think people should live here on earth, okay? But they believed that the kingdom of God would be fulfilled and that the whole history of the world would be brought to culmination. Now, even this moment right now, here we are in the 21st century, there are apocalyptic groups who have very intense eschatologies, who look at history this way and are trying to bring about the culmination of history. Okay, so this is, it continues with it, sticks with us, okay? But anyway, this anointed figure, this Messiah, would bring about this culmination of history. Now, various Jewish groups disagreed on the details of how the kingdom of God would be engendered by their activity. In other words, how can one participate in this kingdom and bring it about? There was a group known as the Pharisees, you've probably heard of. I mean, they're infamous. To be Pharisaical is to be someone who is very nitpicking about following the rules, the law, and so forth. And that's because they thought that strict adherence to the Mosaic law would bring about this end times. There was also a group known as the Sadducees, who believed in a kind of a cultural assimilation with the Hellenic culture. Hellenic culture means Greek culture, Greco-Roman culture, okay? But anyway, they assimilated with Hellenic culture more. And then they thought that later culture, that Roman culture would bring this about. So what was going on in the world outside Jewish circles, they thought, well, this is what God is doing, okay? Now there was another group known as the Essenes, and they kind of like would squirrel themselves away and sequester themselves out in the desert somewhere and live a life of separation and purity, kind of like monks would do, but they weren't monks. They didn't take vows of celibacy or anything. But they lived a life of extreme purity, separation, and simplicity. And they thought that this was the way that you would bring about the kingdom of God. And yet there were even groups known as the Zealots, who were very zealous because they engaged in all kinds of violent activity. In fact, there was one little subgroup within them known as the Sicarii, who would even assassinate key enemies and so forth because they had something like a knife. And that's where the name Sicarii comes from. It was like a knife that they would use to walk up very close to someone and slit their throat very fast and then walk away. Kind of like, ancient assassins, if you will, okay? Like Assassin's Creed, I guess. Anyway, so when Jesus arrives, and he's proclaiming his message is entirely different from what all these other groups are thinking. And everyone thinks of this as a new way, and later on it will be called the way. Now, at some point, in Antioch of Syria, people will begin to use the name Christian, which means kind of like little Christ, and we'll use that as kind of an epithet to ridicule the followers of Christ. But the name will stick, and they will say, yes, we are little Christ. You know, we're trying to follow Christ and be like Him. Okay, but anyway, the movement at first was known as the Way, and it was a new way. And so Jesus' message, we will see, is unique, and His teachings on the kingdom of God, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, are unique.